So the format of this session is going to be, we're going to have a presentation from Keith Bell, UKERC co-director, about future UKERC research priorities. And then we're going to have a response from our excellent panel, which is Joanne Wade, you've already heard from ADE, and UKERC Advisory Board Chair, Dhara Vyas from Energy UK, Sara Walker, Professor Sara Walker from University of Birmingham, and Damitha Adikaari from DESNES. So I'll come at the end of those responses from our panel. I'll come to you as the audience for questions. So do start thinking now if there's things that you want to ask the panel, comments you want to make about future research priorities. It will be hopefully quite more of a kind of discursive element. So people will be sat down when they give their comments. So I'd suggest if you can't see, then you can choose to move forward now. But I think Keith will probably be stood at the lectern to do his presentation. So I will pass straight over to Keith.
Very nice to see so many friends here, and new friends and old friends. And of course, I'm covering this session in place of Rob, who, as we heard this morning, isn't able to be here today. So the Research Councils had invited Rob to lead a new proposal for another phase of work in UKERC. And there was a consultation process that went on around that, talking to lots of people across the sector. And Rob himself putting a lot of thought into it and talking to various people who were invited to come and help him put this together as co-directors of a proposed new phase. And the sort of context for that consultation and that thinking are these sorts of things. So in particular, the COP processes go on, the Conference of the Parties continued push, there should be a continued push to reducing global greenhouse gas emissions. A particular call in the global stocktake at COP28 to drive the transition away from fossil fuels in energy systems in a just, orderly and equitable manner, which speaks right to the centre of, I think, as we've heard today, things that UKERC has been addressing since the beginning. We've had the Energy Act was passed last year. Here are just some features from it. The delivery of infrastructure, highlighted in terms of including licensing, incentivising of CO2, capture and transport, hydrogen networks, a new net zero duty for Ofgem, which hopefully Jane will be able to make good use of. She's shaking her head. No, I don't know. She's trying. Heat networks brought into Ofgem's remit. We've heard from the Electricity Networks Commissioner last summer calling for, recommending various things that can be done to speed up network development. And then the government responding quite positively to that and saying, yeah, that's lots of good ideas there. We're going to try and accelerate all of that. Establishment, as we've heard earlier today, of a new national energy system operator. And although it's not been spelled out or I think put across officially, very likely that they will have, responsibility for developing the strategic spatial energy plan, which was one of the main recommendations of the Electricity Networks Commissioner. But also regional energy system plans that we again heard about a little bit earlier. And kind of around that, we've also got the background of the Climate Change Committee, of which I'm a member, warning, I've been warning for a few years actually, that things are off track, and they're particularly off track right now. And although we didn't know this was going to be the case when we were starting to write the proposal, it was quite likely that the 2030 emission reduction target in Scotland would have to be abandoned. And that was announced by the Cabinet Secretary in the Scottish Parliament just the other day. So there's a danger there of a kind of a policy vacuum in Scotland, and also potentially a dangerous precedent being set to policymakers in other parts of the country. So a lot of challenges in there, and perhaps primary among them is about delivery. So we've had all this time of setting targets and coming up with outline proposals and pathways. So we've got to actually get on and start to do things. The electricity sector, we've seen emissions coming down a lot. We've got to do that now much more in other sectors and on the kind of use of electricity as well. Big part of that and kind of minimizing the total infrastructure need and utilizing the assets to the best way possible is about flexibility in the energy system. So how is that all pulled together? Very interested, Paul, when you were speaking earlier, the first thing you had on your list of things to address was grid integration of low carbon energy and of renewables in particular. So what does that mean? Okay, people like me, an electrical engineer, have been talking about that for a long time. It's good to hear other people now recognizing it as a thing that the electricity sector is not yet done. So quite a lot of what we're going to address is integration of that with other energy vectors. But also, whereas we're still going to continue to have fossil fuels in the mix, materials for all sorts of equipment, batteries, wind turbines, and so on. So the geopolitics of the energy transition becomes, well, it was important, but remains extremely important. And of course, affordability and justice, absolutely essential to get the public acceptability of this transition and mean that it can all be paid for in a fair way. And I think a really important part of the feature of the proposal is about our ability to respond to events. And we've seen that, I think, in the fourth phase that's just finishing. We were able to respond. It was mentioned earlier, the Pot Zero paper, for example. We want to be able to beef up that ability in terms of the modelling capacity that sits behind it. So it's not just speculation, informed speculation by experts, specialists, but we can produce some of the numerical and quantitative analysis to back up the qualitative analysis to suggest what might be the impacts of certain policy proposals or what directions might be pursued. And the evidence review is continuing. Now, kind of associated with that, some areas where we want to bring in, definitely new partners and beef up the capability relative to what we've had in the current phase, for example. So a number of labs that Rob himself will lead and try to coordinate and link in with some of those challenges, energy markets, heat and transport transitions, about social acceptance, especially around kind of spatial developments, electricity overhead lines being a kind of obvious case in point. How can we kind of navigate that and help processes to be developed that allow people to reach a verdict, a judgment collectively of what they can live with as distinct from what they can't live with, such that we can still get the necessary infrastructure developed in a timely way. Backed up by other forms of capability and engagement with the community, with the research community and also the user community, if you like. So the Public Engagement Observatory that Jason talked about earlier will continue with new activities such as new methods to do the mapping, some of the mapping that Jason was talking about, convening a network of people interested in similar sorts of things and helping to shape policy and innovation and all involved in accelerating that transition. The Energy Data Centre, that we've heard about how important that is to be maintained and extended. But also building in from the beginning, and Marcus here would emphasise this very, very strongly, the integration of all these different challenges and these different missions to make sure that they form a collective whole, because it's very unlikely you can kind of get anything built without addressing the engineering, the environmental acceptability of it and impacts, and the financing of it. So we have to draw all this together in an integrated way. And that also means integrating with other centres. So UKERC is not the only centre. I think Mari from the Energy Demand Research Centre, I think yesterday evening, talked about UKERC as being the older sister, which I really like that. Yeah, that sounds really good. So we have to work with our younger sister and other siblings, if you like, in this space. And I'm looking forward to, hopefully, if this is not all funded yet, it's still under review, if we get the opportunity to do that, I'm really looking forward to that. And there's a convening power as well, I guess partly through UKERC's longevity and kind of brand and recognition, to bring people together to events like this, but also maybe some more specialised topics and other places. That's good. I've only got like one more thing to say. So yeah, it's unusual for me. Everyone's saying, Keith's going to shut up at the right time. So yeah, we'll continue to do that and represent, hopefully, represent the UK research community internationally. You heard Jim Watson earlier talking about the European Energy Research Alliance and other forums like that. And all of that comes together. You've got to have a nice diagram, or I was talking earlier about liking the messy diagram. Nikki, you like the messy one. So is this a messy one or a neat one? We need some more arrows kind of randomly across the piece in this one. Maybe this is a bit too neat. Hopefully it captures all on one page, all the things that I've been talking about. So those are the challenges. Okay, there's a prioritization that's had to go on in there. There's lots of things that we could add to that list. And I'll be really interested to hear our panellists and what they think about what we've already put out, or what they would strongly argue should be added in, and then we'll see how we can support it. Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Keith. Admirably to time. If I could ask our 4 panel members to join us on the stage, that would be very helpful. So we've heard from Keith about some of our proposed priorities for the next 5 years. Obviously, the agenda we're talking about now is for much longer than that, for 20 years. So to remind people, 20 years will be 2044. We all expect to live in a very transformed world by that time. So I'd invite our 4 panel that we'd like to have here to offer your comments both on Keith's outline and also your own views on priorities for the coming years. So if I could go to Joanne first.
Yes, absolutely. So I think for me, 2 of the most crucial and also the most difficult challenges that we've got to get right if we're going to be where we want to be in 20 years' time are obviously decarbonising heat, but then also getting the balance right between local energy solutions and the large-scale national or regional energy infrastructure. And I think those 4 challenges that Keith, you talked about are the right ones for UKERC to be taking forward now. So I'd just like to frame my initial thoughts in terms of how that plays out in those 2 wicked areas that we've got to deal with. So if we think about delivery, first of all, it's clear from the evidence we've got that locally specific, locally co-designed solutions have got the potential to reduce the total infrastructure investment that we need for the transformation we're trying to make. But they tend not, the conversation doesn't tend to play out that way because there are potentially quite high initial transaction costs. You know, it's really hard to get millions of people to do what you want them to do. So people go, oh, it's too difficult and it's too costly, what are we going to do? But as we heard last night from Lord Deaburn, on the flip side of that is you can really often avoid those really costly, long things like planning inquiries, often if you get it right and do it locally. So my question is, do we know well enough how to quantify the costs and benefits of these very different things? They happen with different actors, they happen in different geographies, and they happen over different timeframes. And are we good enough at comparing them? And I don't think we are. If you think about flexibility, your second challenge, you won't be surprised to hear that I don't think it's all about storing stuff in fuels. And I know you don't, Keith, either, but you know, of course it's partly about that. But the demand side and flexibility is crucial. And I think for me, there are 2 questions here. The first one, the short-term one, is how do we get a massive uptake in small scale, like domestic scale flexibility? But then the second question, the longer term one, is, are we thinking about designing the system in the right way to maximise demand flexibility in the future? So when we decide how energy efficient we want our buildings to be, are we just talking about least cost now, or are we thinking about heat flexibility in the future? We might end up with a different answer to how energy efficient we want to be if we're thinking about heat flexibility as well. Geopolitics, I don't really do geopolitics, but I think the only thing I would say there is, are we using an energy sufficiency framework to think about all the constraints on the system? And if not, why not? And that links to my final question, which is, how do we make best use of local energy planning with the full involvement of local communities to ensure that all those challenges around affordability and justice and contested change, how we're going to meet those well? How are we going to use local planning to meet those well?
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Joanne. And really interesting as well to hear those comments about how we balance short and long-term costs and benefits. Can I pass over to you, Dhara?
Yeah, of course. Thanks for inviting me to join. I was just talking to Joanne about the affection I feel for the UKERC, and I think that the work that you all do as part of this programme is so important. And one of those strengths, I think, lies in being able to work with industry and government and other actors. I think that's really important that UKERC continues to do that in the coming decades. When we spoke beforehand, we tried to agree that we wouldn't all just viciously agree and say the same thing. So I'm going to kind of come at it from a slightly different angle. I'm just going to try and talk about 2 of the things that I think are going to be really important, although obviously there are hundreds of things, and if not thousands of things that we think should be important. I think you know, we've experienced an energy crisis, which has been a crisis of both affordability and security. The response to both of those crises needs to be investment in domestic clean energy generation and technologies. It needs to be improving our infrastructure so we can connect more and move it around more effectively and efficiently and smartly. And it needs to be about targeted support for people who can least afford to pay for the energy that they use, and to decarbonise and improve their homes as well, because it will always be the case that the cheapest unit of energy is the energy you don't use. So that's the challenge I think we've got ahead of us. The next 5 years are going to be crucial if we are going to deliver our targets over the coming decades. It's what we do now that will be developed in 10 years or so. When it comes to investment, capital has a choice of location, and this isn't a panel about the global outlook or the geopolitics, but that's where we are right now as a country. We operate in a global environment, and the next government, I think, needs to be bold around supply-side reform in order to attract investment into the UK where we need it. We've done an amazing story in this. Got an amazing story to tell in this country about decarbonisation. The power sector's led the way. I think the next steps are going to be harder. It is about business decarbonisation. It is about the conversation with people. And so that's the flip side to this. I think where, you know, there's this big investment gap, but there's also this huge overhang on us, I think, about the public conversation that we need to have with people, whether that conversation is about where we put transmission towers, whether that conversation is about how we get decarbonised heat, how we get 80% of homes that are on gas right now for cooking and heating, how we change that, or how we improve homes. That's really tricky, it's intrusive and it's difficult, and that comes to Joanne's demand side point. We need to be able to do that in a way that effectively sells them as a story and really helps people to feel the benefits of engaging with energy. So the two things I think that are on my mind for the coming 20 years will be a big piece around investment and a big piece around that conversation with the public. I think industry's got a lot to contribute there, but neither of those things can happen by industry alone.
Marvellous. Thank you so much, Dhara. Can we move straight on to you, Sara? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to talk a bit today. My research area is very much around whole energy systems, and those approaches enable us to open up opportunities and find new ways of optimising systems which help us benefit from synergies. Neil pointed out that the more complex your system view and the more complex the problem is, then the more difficult it becomes to model. And models are there to provide indicators rather than be absolute truths of the system. So I think it's really useful to see, as part of the proposed UKERC work, that the Social Acceptance and Infrastructure Planning Lab is going to provide some of that whole systems thinking, cutting across the themes. So getting to net zero is so much more than where and when we put pipes or cables in the ground, or heaven forbid, overhead lines near someone that spoke yesterday about difficulties of getting planning. But it's also about those supply technologies and the people skills that theme 2 in UKERC talks about. It's also about the geopolitics in theme 3 that UKERC includes in its new programme. It's also about price and affordability, which theme 4 is going to address. And so by zooming out and connecting the dots, this bigger picture is really important, and I hope that that Infrastructure Planning Lab can deliver on that. I think there are still some gaps with regards understanding the process of organisational change that incumbents are expected to undertake if they are to help deliver net zero. And we shouldn't forget institutions in that social acceptance piece. I also think there's opportunities to evaluate the effectiveness of mega projects like HS2 and try and transfer those learnings to the mega project, which is our decarbonised energy system. And for industrial decarbonisation, I welcome the flexible fund that UKERC is proposing, because to work closely with industry partners, to understand their research questions and to work in agile ways to support their journey is really vital for that industrial decarbonisation piece. And the final thing I would say is UKERC at 20. Are you now the incumbent, or do you still want to be the disruptor? And it's important to understand which you want to be and why. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sarah. And Damitha, I could ask you to finish the panel, please.
Thanks so much, Jess. Lots of great points, and there's nothing much to add. So I'm at a disadvantage because I'm the last speaker. But let me try and answer the question in a slightly different sense. First of all, I want to thank UKERC for all the work they've done over the 20 years. They've had quite a impactful set of programs over the years, and we've heard various speakers setting out how they have been impactful. And I wish them all the very best. And it looks like you're starting from a good strategic approach as to how the next 5 years are going to shape. I say that because Carbon Budget 6 needs to be delivered within 160 months. And UKERC is going to continue to work in the next phase 60 months of that. So it's very important, and it's an opportunity, like Sara says, that if you want to be disruptor, you have to be targeted, and you have to be in support of delivery of the challenge. For me, which is the most important aspect. I say that because we hear quite often about how great we've done and the decarbonisation of the UK economy by 50%, which you hear these days quite often. But then all that has been achieved from a supply side focused approach. And the next stage is demand focused. And your second mission is at the heart of that. But then again, it's easy to say that that's important and there are lots of works to be done. But there are still unknowns from a data perspective, solutions perspective, as well as the net part of net zero. I say that because whatever the work you do in the near term, which will help reduce the demand, will help manage the uncertainties associated with the net part of the net zero problem beyond Carbon Budget 7. So it's not just the deliverability impact that you can have in the near term, which is going to be a challenge and important. It will contribute to make the journey faster, cheaper, and easier. I think there's lots of opportunities for you to do. I know that resources are constrained as well from the challenges perspective and the capabilities perspective. One thing we tend to sometimes forget, and I don't think I heard this afternoon anyone mentioning, is the skills challenge.
I didn't get around to it. Sorry.
And skills at all different levels, if you really think about the next half, is a big issue. And I'm not quite sure whether we have collectively thought long and hard about it. And time is catching up on us. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Damitha. Thanks to all the panel for those brilliant comments. I'm sure we could have a debate for many hours just within the panel about some of those issues that have been raised, but we really want to bring in the expertise in the room. I think we've got some mics at the back and we've got about 15 minutes for questions. So if you've got a question or a comment on your views on priorities for the coming years, if I can ask you to raise your hand, please. So we've got a question, Jen, in the red, please.
Yeah, thanks very much. Hello, Jennifer Pride from Welsh Government. Been really interesting. It's really my first proper exposure to UKERC work, and it's as a whole, and it's really exciting. Some things have really resonated, some things not quite so much. And I think that's an opportunity perhaps for UKERC to explore, because I think where it's not resonated, maybe because of devolution, which is now coming up to 20 years old as well. In Wales, certainly, when devolution first came in, it was really seen as an opportunity for experimentation and for different approaches to be tested in different places, and then see how that learning could be applied across across a wider perspective. In Wales, we've got the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which I think is really helpful in helping us think through that environmental, social, economic, cultural, and long-term perspective, which then drives us towards that whole systems approach. So I think my challenge really is very much to UKERC, how can you use the opportunities, the empowerment for different places to do different things in terms of informing your research as you go forward? And I'd also like to just tag on a quick one about the energy that you don't use is the cheapest. I don't know in the hard to treat homes whether that's actually true. So it'd be really good to see if there's any evidence that backs that up.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Did anyone want to come back on that comment, particularly around kind of the learning developed over almost 20 years of devolution? And I could maybe start by saying slightly that some of our research within the existing Theme 2 in UKERC has looked at some of those different policy and approaches across England, Scotland and Wales. And certainly I think there is some evidence of diverging approaches on some policy areas, and it's an opportunity for considerable learning about what works going forward, I think. And we're starting to produce some of that evidence at the moment.
Yeah, I would just agree with that, you know, we need to do more of it. And I'm delighted that we've got a really strong participation from Cardiff University, for example, in the consortium. And, you know, I heard from Mason earlier in a case study that he presented, which was very much, you know, focused on South Wales. We've had a good presence in Scotland for quite a while as part of the consortium. So to extend that to Wales, definitely strengthen it in Wales, but actually the big absence is participation from Northern Ireland. So, you know, it's UK, not just GB Energy Research Centre. So you know, that's a challenge I would give us actually, is to you know to do more over there as well.
And Joanne, did you want to comment at all on Jennifer's comment around kind of place-based demonstrators and learning, and how that might play into kind of bigger policy learning?
Yeah, I think it's tricky, isn't it? Because there's so much information that you've got to gather together and try and process. But we'd spend an awful lot of time doing international comparisons, and they're great. But you always preface the results with, but of course this might not work in the UK context. And it's kind of, we've got a huge diversity of approaches within the UK context that we could learn from without that initial barrier of saying, well, it's culturally completely different in whatever country you're talking about. You know, so I think we undervalue our homegrown experience. And I think to be able to use it, the thing we don't do is whenever we fund these sort of things, we don't build in enough funding to evaluate them and to collect the data. There's an awful lot of stuff going on, but nobody has any time or money to evaluate it. And I think that's the barrier to making better use of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there any other questions? So we've got one on the front, which we'll come to. Can I maybe take two? I'll take the one here, and then also the question from Paul at the front, and then we'll go with both questions to the panel, please.
Yeah, Ashley Hastings from the University of Aberdeen. You mentioned that we need to train up the next generation to do this, to actually enact this. And yet, I remember going to some of the earlier UKERC project meetings in Warwick University, where there was about 50 PhD students who were associated with UKERC. Now, as well as training 50 people, that also was an incredible multiplier to the research work of UKERC. And I don't see why UKRA has dropped that idea. If you go to most of the EU projects like the Horizon or the FP7 or whatever, you will find that there are so many PhD students associated with that because they are funded by the funders. And I really think it's time that UKRA actually changed its mind and actually allowed big projects like this to have associated PhD students, because they're multipliers and they also train the next generation.
Thank you very much. Before the panel comes back on that, we'll go to Paul's question at the front, please.
Thanks very much. I very much like the final slide that you had, you know, your diagram, because it wasn't too complicated, and therefore I could understand it, looking at it just quite quickly. And I noticed in your theme 4, you had something about economic implications. And I wonder if you could just elaborate on that a bit. For me, as I think I said right in my earlier remarks at the start, the macroeconomics of this transition are going to be the battleground of the next 5 years. That's where the politics is going to be, and we're going to hear all this stuff. And I think one of you said that the issue of investment, and it clearly isn't all going to come from the public sector. In fact, most of it, the great majority, isn't going to come from the public sector. The issue of investment is also absolutely critical. And at the moment, where I'm sitting, either the US or the EU is a much more attractive place to invest in this stuff than the UK. And I just wonder whether those issues are going to be squeezed into box number 4, or whether actually we need to get that work done somewhere else.
I can answer that very quickly. Yes. I'm not sure it's box number 4 or box number 5, but the macroeconomic modelling capability, particularly to look at sort of the multiplier effects and the distributional effects, is very much what we have in mind to try to do. Yep.
Yeah, I'd maybe also invite Caroline as well behind you. Do you want to talk about kind of geopolitics, supply chains, some of that kind of global race type stuff? If you'd like to.
I had actually a completely other comment. But
Go for it.
It was just, I think it was Joanne who was saying when we were looking at geopolitics, were we thinking about it in a sort of sufficiency type framework? And so I just want to say a few things on that. So the first thing is that clearly most political leaders in the world are not thinking about it. Hence we have the geopolitics. But one of the things that we're hoping to do as part of that work package is to reimagine geopolitics through the lenses of low energy demand futures. And actually also reimagine energy security. So what does energy security look like if you don't have your supply side hat on, which most people do when they think about energy security? What happens if you put a demand side hat on when you're thinking about it? So it's very much part of what we would like to be doing.
Excellent. Good to hear.
Dhara, did you want to come in?
Just very quickly on the investment point. So where we sit, we see the real world and real life in quite immediate impact of political decisions or political indecisiveness when we talk to our members, because their boards have been choosing to make that investment elsewhere, where once that might have been on track to go into the UK. And I think that whilst things have improved, they're not quite there yet, and the clear message from investors is one that is calling for certainty. You're absolutely right. In the OBR figures, 70% of the investment the UK needs to transition to net zero will come from the private sector. But the private sector, capital has a choice of location. I think I already said that the private sector right now isn't always choosing to invest in the UK. There is appetite for it, and there is still a keenness for the UK as a location to invest because of our track record. But I think where we've sort of been winning the race, we're beginning to stagnate and stand still. So I think that's the kind of main message that we're getting from industry.
Yeah, Sara.
Just to make a comment on the PhD question. So EPSRC fund about 45% of their scholarships in the form of centres for doctoral training. About 45% come through doctoral training programmes, and about 10% are through iCase. So as UKERC, there's opportunities for for UKERC to have iCase opportunities with industry. As winners of EPSRC money, you get kickback in terms of the number of DTP places that you get is proportionate to, based on some unknown formula that they use. Based on the number of DTPs is based on the amount of grant money that you win. And then the rest is competitive centres for doctoral training. Is that a good way compared to simply aligning it to the research projects? Well, it spreads the love. is all I would say in terms of trying to ensure that more universities have access to scholarships.
I'd like to comment on that skills bit as well. I mean, Damitha, you're totally right to emphasise that. I think I tend to agree with you, actually. I think there's a real problem with the development of PhD students and the opportunities that they have. That creates a real problem for universities in terms of postdocs. You know, we know as academics that's the supply chain of the talent, and eventually some of them will stick around as academics. But it's also a problem for industry. I think there's a real need for PhD graduates going into the energy industry. There's a lot of kind of thinking to be done that a good PhD trains people for and gives them a good grounding in. And it's just not coming through. I mean, Sara set out very well the current situation with how UKERC fund it. I was scanning the room to see if our UKERC friends are still here. I actually think EPSRC completely screwed up the last CDT round, especially in the way they approached energy and energy systems and electricity systems. EPSRC ran a kind of, what was it? Sara, you were there as well, I think, and a few of us were there. The strategy thing in November in Solihull. What was the kind of billing of that? Was that to do with net zero or energy and net zero? I can't remember now.
Energy and net zero, yeah.
Energy and net zero. And as an electrical engineer, it really struck me that the top thing, all the 70-odd people in all their kind of breakout groups with yellow sticky notes came back and said the big kind of priority that needs to be researched into is the electricity system and how it all hangs together. That's grid integration. If only they'd said that 6 or 12 months before, then EPSRC might not have got their CDT review process so wrong.
Thank you. And Damitha, you wanted to come in?
Again, on the same thing. So just to take it away a little bit, yes, PhDs are necessary. It's part and parcel of the research establishment that we have, and they contribute a lot, and additionality is great. But it takes 3 years and a little bit longer for them to train and come through. I've done this in my previous lives, been a researcher before as well. The comment I made about skills is not just PhD or highest level. Yeah. It's all the way, especially thinking about the demand side requirements that we have, be it the 600,000 heat pump ambition or the trajectories that we are trying to achieve from electric vehicles uptake, or the infrastructure associated with it, or the Nick Windsor recommendations to accelerate the 14 years to 7, and what it entails. That requires all sorts of levels from all the way up to level 8. And my comment was around not funding a lot more. Great if you can, because they contribute to economy eventually. But what UKERC could do to accelerate, retrain, in terms of the societal impact perspective, there is very little thinking which has gone into it. People are waking up to the fact that it's hard to recruit and it takes time. One example is that in government parlance, I'm the senior responsible owner for the Rolls-Royce small modular reactor development project, which is a 3-year-long project to design a modular reactor design. The original plan was to have 800 people. The project started at the beginning with 150, and it was really hard to ramp up to find the right people, and that's not just at level 8.
Yeah, and that's a great point about all levels.
Brilliant.
Yeah, so Dhara.
Just very quickly on jobs and skills, I would add though that I don't disagree with anything. It's true right across the industry. So, you don't often go a week without seeing a headline about poor customer service in energy suppliers. It's been incredibly difficult to recruit and retain staff in call centres. You need people who can navigate the complexity of policy and regulation, as well as the engineers and the installers on the ground as well. So you do need people right across the energy system.
Brilliant.
And it's a problem.
Yeah. I don't want to stand in between any of you and refreshments after, so we could go on for much longer, but I think we're probably going to need to bring it to a close there. So I'd just like to say a huge thank you to our whole panel and ask you to join me in thanking them.